Hello YouTube, I'm Toby. Now for a while I've been hunting around for spare parts, and I finally got enough spare parts to build a computer. And what you're seeing right here is the finished product. Now what's inside the system? We have some random motherboard without a I/O shield. It is an AM3 socket, and thus I have an Athlon 2 X2's 270 CPU in there. It is a dual core processor clocked at 3.4 GHz, so it's not much, but it'll do for now. The graphics card is my old GTX 550 Ti. I actually did a video on this card already, but for the purpose of this video we'll be playing in 720p, whereas I actually tested the card in 1080p before. Furthermore, we have 8GB of DDR3 RAM. We have a used 700 watt power supply and a SSD from Kingston at 240 GB. But before we get into the benchmarking, let's take a quick look at the build video. Alright, so a little bit of quick cable management later, and the computer is actually complete. Now the benchmarks we'll be running in this video are Cinebench R15, OpenGL, the Resident Evil 6 benchmarking tool, Counter-Strike Source, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Subnautica, PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, and Fortnite. Starting out with Cinebench R15, we ended with a score of 158 points, which is, well, what you'd expect from an old Athlon. The OpenGL test went very smooth, and we ended with a score of 46 frames per second. As I always do, I fired up the Resident Evil 6 benchmarking tool. I set the settings to medium and let the benchmark run. We ended with a final score of 5,536 points, which I am quite happy about. I honestly didn't expect it to be this much. Next benchmark is Counter-Strike Source. I started out with the integrated benchmarking tool that's in the game. The settings were set to high, and we ended with a score of 217 frames per second. Now benchmarking scores and actual gameplay are two very different things, so naturally I fired up a bot match. We ended with a score in the bot match of somewhere between 80 and 130 frames per second, so very playable on this system. Next up, I took it a step further and fired up Counter-Strike Global Offensive. I set these settings to medium, and we were running a very smooth frame rate actually, somewhere between 25 and 60 frames per second. Not quite enough for pro players, but well, it actually ran very smooth here. Now in Subnautica there was a little stutter, but I did set the settings to low, and we're seeing a frame rate somewhere between 30 and 65 frames per second. So also very playable on this system. PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds is another story though. Although I set all the settings to very low, we're seeing a frame rate somewhere between 15 and 35 FPS, and the game was very stuttery to say the least. Last benchmark we'll be running is Fortnite. I set the settings to pretty much as low as they would go, and it really wasn't a smooth experience. It was running somewhere between 15 and 60 frames per second. So not really a smooth experience, and I wouldn't really call this playable on this system. Now I've also compiled some MSI Afterburner data on the benchmarks here, and during Counter-Strike Global Offensive we were seeing what I would call somewhat a CPU bottleneck. Subnautica also seemed to show a slight CPU bottleneck, as well did both PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds and Fortnite. So it's pretty clear that the CPU in this system really needs to be upgraded, and thus I actually had a Phenom 2 X2 560 laying around. It's also dual core clocked at 3.4 GHz, I believe. So it should be a little better than the Athlon, so let's give it a shot. Now I fired up Cinebench R15 just to verify that we were seeing an increased CPU score. Honestly, we didn't get as much of a difference in score as I wanted. We only increased the final score by 7 points, which is pretty much worthless. Now just to be sure, I fired up Fortnite once again, set the settings to low, and well, it really didn't seem to make much of a difference. I have to admit my keyboard and mouse, they're wireless, so they seem to be not really dealing too well with this, but we did see somewhat the same score, and to be quite honest, I didn't expect much else. So what's the future of this system? Well, I'm gonna see if I can get an FX processor or something better for the AM3 platform, just to see if we can get a nice cheap gaming PC out of this system. But I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you very much for watching.